Welcome back to the Unlicensed Therapist. I am so glad to have you with us today. We have an excellent guest who is going to help us explore Jungian counseling. So we're not going to be looking at the theory in the abstract, but as a living, breathing way of understanding how it works in the therapy room. We're going to see how Jungian work treats symptoms as messages, dreams as maps, and personal struggles as chapters in a larger story of becoming whole. We're also going to look at how it has evolved in Christian or spiritual contexts and how it adapts to community mental health and group practice. My guest I have known since they began in community mental health. They have just recently transferred from that setting to a group practice, so I am so excited to be able to sit down with them, ask some questions about an area of counseling that I myself am not very familiar with, but find exciting and interesting. So stick around. I'll be right back with our guest. The following is part one of my interview with Andrew Shroyer, MA, LAPC. I want to thank Andrew for coming onto the podcast. We had some technical difficulties with the first half of the podcast, and he was gracious to stick with me for an hour while I worked out those kinks. Unfortunately, because of those technical difficulties, we did lose the first question and answer that I asked. But here we pick up with the follow-up question and a nice conversation. As I said, part one of multiple. Enjoy. So, Andrew, how did your Christian worldview develop, and how does it shape your understanding of healing? I mean, obviously, you've mentioned going to seminary, you've mentioned the idea of preaching a sermon, so there is some knowledge there and faith. How does it affect what you do as a counselor?
So it's interesting for me. If you had asked me this a year or two ago, it would have been a little bit different of an answer. But for me, as I sit here today, the faith journey is something that has been a very complex thing. Obviously, I didn't complete seminary, so there was at a point when I decided that world wasn't for me. And that was obviously years of discernment and thought, thinking, and reflection. And, well, let me just say, as I was thinking about how I was going to go forward with my life and what I wanted to do afterwards, naturally, I started reading some spiritual thinkers, and it did gravitate me towards Jung. And the reason why it gravitated towards Jung is it's like, this is something that is it fits in with what I want to do, because Jung has a statement, and I want to bring that up really quickly because I don't want to just paraphrase it, but he has a psychology. His psychology is meant for people whom spirituality is very important for people, but that doesn't necessarily have to mean that it, one, takes place in a religious tradition, or two, looks like what the religious traditions make it to look like. For example, like prayer, reading a sacred scripture, or something like that. I want to quote that directly and see here. Nope, let me see. I know exactly where it is in my book. Apologize.
No, not a problem.
When all else fails, go to my books. Aha, here we go. It says, I am not addressing myself to the happy possessors of faith, but to those many people for whom the light has gone out, the mystery is faded, and God is dead. For most of them, there is no going back, and one does not know either whether going back is the better way. To gain an understanding of religious matters, probably all that is left us today is the psychological approach. That is why I take these thought forms, meaning the historically religious traditions, that have become historically fixed, try to melt them down again and pour them into molds of immediate experience. And that looks a lot like dream analysis. And he had a practice called active imagination, where he would go into the places of his dreams that he would dialogue with them. And so that was the way of kind of like spiritual practices that doesn't look a lot like, if you were to walk into a Christian church today and, go to whatever church you might go to, a Catholic church, a Methodist church, a Pentecostal church, whatever that might look like, that doesn't look, like that. But what he's trying to do is, understand those and how it relates to us as individuals in this modern era. And this is one way of doing that. And I will say that it can't apply to anybody, whether you are actively religious or whether you don't have any interest whatsoever in religion. So where that puts me today is I spend a lot of my time doing that. I read a lot of texts that wouldn't necessarily be considered sacred text, but I take them and say, okay, how can this be living, and a living myth? And I know you have questions about living myths coming up later. And so it looks a lot like doing. First off, I pay close attention to my dreams. That's first and foremost. Secondly, I pay attention to where my emotions go throughout the day. My emotions are kind of like the language of my soul. If I'm chronically feeling, as we'll kind of get to in a little bit, if I'm chronically feeling worn out, irritated, like at what I'm doing, well, I know for a fact that I'm not where I need to be at that moment. And so I need to listen to that, and that can be something that will change the trajectory of my life. And that is following my own spiritual path as I see it. But the Christianity has given me the language, and it was kind of like the springboard for that, because Jung uses a lot of Christianity to say how his psychological thought and how it relates. There's been a lot of books actually written about, I have them actually out there, but he has a whole work, Psychology and Religion. There's been all kinds of texts written of like how you can understand Christianity through a psychological lens and what that means for your own transformation. And so that is kind of where I'm at now. It's kind of like a foot in one door of Christianity, but foot out of it too. And it's kind of like a putting in both camps, and there's a tension there. And it it's not always easy, but it is fulfilling because it's giving me the two things that I need. One, a community, and two, spiritual images to go off of, and growth, and stories that help you connect, and meaning, ultimately, which is really what we're going after. I think that is how, Jungian psychology applies to everybody, but we'll get to that later.
In my personal journey, I've seen that Jungian psychology definitely can be attractive to the Christian, and I'm seeing in the occult, in the New Age, in the pagan, that there is an attraction there as well, that there's a feeling of safety. What about someone who is agnostic or an atheist? Is your approach something that would make that person feel safe?
Absolutely, and that's sort of jumping ahead again too. When we were in community mental health, it kind of was like the thing of anybody that thought that they had if they even mentioned in the intake something about spirituality, I was immediately put with them, and I didn't necessarily like that very distinctive, like, okay, this is the spiritual guy, as opposed to I can't just see any person in this apply, because I think it does just as much to them. Now, in the critique of Jung famously helped Bill Moyers to at least have the philosophical outlook of what AA would be like. The big book. Jung was very helpful in the philosophical outlook on that. And one of the big things with the AA, the big book, is having the right relationship with your ego. And the ego loves to be in charge. And this applies as much, if not more, to spiritual people as it does to non-spiritual people. So my approach really looks like, is your ego in charge? And if it isn't, then if you're open enough to explore that your way of doing things might not be the only correct way of doing things, and there might be things that you're missing in what you're doing. Obviously, if you have these needs that you're not able to be expressed currently, I think that it is something that we can really, Jungian psychology can really help to have that correct developing meaning in your own life. Like, you don't have to be believe in God or anything like that to just look at your dreams and to examine what might they have to say about the trajectory of your life, what you might be missing, what you might be doing differently. So that's what I like to kind of stay with is, I don't go into, dogma or anything like that as it pertains to any of my other clients individually. So that is why I say it definitely has a lot to do with the average person. And you don't have to be strictly religious to be able to explore Jungian psychology.
So Andrew Shroyer goes from high school into seminary. While he is in the seminary, there is some feeling of, this is not 100% the place for me. I want to be doing more of the counseling side of things. You move into that area, and obviously once you enter a grad program, they flood you with different modalities, different theories, different ways to look at things. Was Jung an instantaneous click? This is who I am, this is where I belong? Were there others that you considered along the way? Or are there others that you sort of tie into your Jungian philosophy?
Yeah, classic to Jung, he very much encouraged, this isn't like a cult or a belief system or anything like that. This is a way of understanding the psyche, but this, there's other people that have a breadth of knowledge and understanding when it comes to, therapy. So, for example, Carl Rogers is somebody I really look up to. I really admire him. We read Irvin Yalom in grad school as well. That is somebody that I think he does a really good job at kind of bringing in a variety of modalities into one. I think I didn't even hear of him before I was in grad school, so we did read him. I was into Jungian psychology and sort of doing my own dream work and depth work before I even entered into grad school. So this was something that I was already in the middle of doing. And then I applied for grad school. And so this was something that the psychology and the depth work and the spiritual work was coming before anything else. And so I came in already being like, yeah, I'm really interested in Jungian psychology, but I'm curious to learn more. So I did have the opportunity to go to 2 different grad programs that were both heavily invested in depth psychology. So the first program was Pacifica Graduate Institute, so that did give me some kind of theoretical foundation, but the second one was Meridian University, which I ended up graduating from. They gave me this really interesting, they were heavily influenced by Thomas More. And Thomas More, I just mentioned to you, I got to meet him, and I was thoroughly enriched by all of his works. And so this was kind of my opportunity to study that stuff a little bit more in depth. I really do like Freud as much as he's kind of like a joke in most psychology courses now. He's actually more looked up to in like literature courses, and I can understand why. That's not my way of seeing things. I have some disagreements with him, obviously, and I have disagreements with Jung. And so it's like, when you come in and I would hope everybody would develop their own way of being able to agree and disagree with certain things. Maybe you even go into one way of looking at things. This involves every area of life too, politically, theologically. Like, this might be my party of choice, but they all have their setbacks, and just like everybody else, every other human institution, that we can't grasp reality just as we are, really. So, that was a little long-winded, but I hope that kind of explained it.
Yeah. I like that you pointed out that this philosophy isn't the quote-unquote cult, because my experience was more in the Carl Rogers ideology, being almost cult-like, as professors sort of shoving that perspective down students' throats, and anyone who was outside of that was looked at as having a different way of thinking. And not that that was good or bad, but it wasn't looked upon as, or didn't come across as, good. So if anything, I felt like there was a Rogerian cult and not anything Jungian-like. I am curious from you, and as I ask this question, I'm going to have you go into a little bit of depth to describe in your own life, through a mythic lens, what stories or archetypes fits your story, and remembering that we have listeners that don't know what an archetype is, don't know what a mythic lens is, and may not even know what, their story is.
Yeah, and it's something that Jung himself says with a lot of the terms. We're not looking for these like very definable. A lot of these things are more experienced and intuited rather than a broad definition of something, which I know tends to, in the West, really make people anxious because we want to be able to define and lock something down. Okay, what is an archetype? It's like, well, we all have a mother and a father. That's the archetype. The archetypal image, which is different, so I'm already going to confuse people, but the difference of the archetypal image is that the individual has an idea of what their own mother and father is. That's the archetypal image. And I spend most of my time with the archetypal images. I don't care about the universal mother and father, any of that stuff. Like, everybody has that, but I'm in therapy. We're, of course, dialoguing with our own understanding of mother and father. And so that is something that we can, spend a lot of time reflecting on. So my own story, my own lens, which is really fascinating, I have always felt like two different mythological lenses or characters. And I'll use, let's say, standard tarot cards because those are archetypal. The major arcana is archetypal in nature. And so when I talk about archetypal images, I have been influenced by the Fool a lot, and I've been influenced by the Hermit because I'm a loner. I am very lucky that my wife is also a loner, and it has, that's been very enriching because the both of us really pull from each other's strengths and weaknesses, which is, obviously it's, there's been some tough times, as you've known, but it has the fact that I can pull back in that hermit sphere and say, well, my own sense of being a hermit is really influenced by the fact that I can pull back and go be within myself, and I can figure out myself. When I feel really stressed, I don't immediately go to church. I don't immediately go to something like that. As a matter of fact, when I was going through a lot of difficult times, it's been me and my dog out in the woods, and that's where I feel most at home. And that has been deeply enriching for me. So you see the hermit there. And when I was going through my most difficult times, this is something that some of my family wasn't understanding, is needing to find my own voice means pulling back in a hermit. Some people do get that by bouncing their ideas off of other people, and I have those times when I'm really enriched by that. But that can't be the norm for me just because that's how I'm wired. And I think that there is something to be said about that. I don't want to say that that isn't positive. That's absolutely positive. But I have definitely been influenced by those two. Some stories that have really shaped me. I still have, by the way, those Uno cards, those Batman versus Superman Uno cards from Healing Bridges. They're sitting right next to me. I absolutely loved Batman vs. Superman from the first time that I watched it. I know it's a very hit or miss movie for people. Some people love it. Some people are like, meh. Some people don't care for it. But I always deeply connected to the Batman character in the movie. He was very broken, very cynical. But at the end, after he goes through his darkest of times, he's able to connect and to find his own light again. And that's really the journey. And that's something that I've always been able to connect with. And especially, for whatever reason, I've always connected to the wise old man archetype, which is essentially what that Batman is. And movies like Unforgiven, The Sixth Rocky Balboa, like those movies really are my favorites in, like, Rocky Balboa is my favorite in that franchise, like, because that has always spoke to me in such a deep way because of, and I've always been pulled towards, when I was young, I was always hanging out with people that were 4 times my age. When I was 15, I was hanging out with people 45, 60 years old. Sounds weird, but I've always gravitated towards that. I've always hung out with my grandfather, my wrestling coach, my football coaches. Like, I was more interested in that than people my own age. And I was always with that because I was always pulling from those people that had more life experience than me. So, yeah, I think that without going too much further into that, that is some of the mythic lenses that have shaped me.
So first, it's not weird because you just told parts of my life right there as well of, clinging more towards those who are a generation or two above you. So I get it.
Our day and age tends to be much more cynical about that stuff and much more, I'll say neurotic about that. So that's why the only reason why I say that is, like, in the 90s and 2000s, I was, like, perfectly, like, yeah, whatever. I mean, we were aware of that stuff, but we're much more unhealthily aware of those things, I would say. Because if you were to ask the average person today, if our civilization today is much safer than decades past, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, they would say, no way, Jose. But we are. Statistically, we are. I always point that out to people because it's not that we're much more chronically online, we're much more chronically aware of every single little thing that might be going on, whereas before, our psyches were not pulled in that direction to be having that much news. We just didn't. We found out about the big stuff. But, in the 80s, it was like, have you checked on your children? Do you know where your children are? It's 10 o'clock at night. Do you know where your children are? That sort of thing had to be almost reminded to parents. But that's almost unheard of now. It's almost like you're a criminal if you do that now. But that's not because our culture has gotten less safe. It's because we have become more neurotic as a culture. So one of my critiques of culture is that we have become that much more. I know that's one of the questions getting down the line. So that's why I wanted to bring that up now.
No, I agree that we get hit with so much information so quickly and so often now compared to those past eras that if they had the access to the same information we had, they'd be reacting in the same way and even probably much greater because you're right. There were more existential and global threats, much less, threats here near home.
Yeah, and that's sort of interesting to dialogue with clients of, like, well, how does that sit with you? Because we're not changed humans. Our actual emotions and our psyche is not changed by information. Like, I can tell clients that information, that, hey, we're actually a lot more safer now than what we were at any point, really, since the 50s. But that doesn't change anybody. And how do we sort of take information and not try to say, well, here's this knowledge, change that. Change because of the knowledge. That's not really how we change. That's why, we could debate politics back and forth all day, and we eventually get into a shouting contest because information doesn't mean anything in a debate about politics. And unfortunately, I wish it did, but it doesn't. It's about, you start seeing, again, these archetypal patterns coming up of tribalism, scapegoating. All of these patterns start arising, and it doesn't matter what political party you're part of, everybody does it. So it's not like one party has escaped this or has become so far transformed as a human that you're beyond that. I had to grow into that myself as I was going through college and learned that the hard way. Because I thought at one point that, hey, one party seems to not be doing that more. And then I realized everybody does it.
Yeah. And it's good that you're painting the archetypes in a way that there is no good or bad archetype. They are, and it's how long you live there or what you do while you're in that archetype, not the fact that you lean towards the hermit, the gesture, the mother, the father. It's what you do when you're in those roles. I want to take and spin back to our days in the institution of community mental health. And we both know that there was a structure and it affects clinicians and shapes clinicians. You were unique in the fact that you said, hey, if there was a spiritual issue, it goes to Andrew. That person goes to Andrew automatically. You had a different way of looking at therapy from the other counselors. So, how did that community mental health experience shape you? And what strengths did you gain from it? What constraints did you gain or did you see?
Well, I already mentioned the constraint of it became like this very explicit, he's the spiritual guy, so send anybody to him, and that became like 75% of my caseload. I want to be more specific in saying that overall, I would say that here's a quote that Jung would say that every single one of his clients that he would see in therapy had usually a second half of life problem. And I'll kind of get to that in a minute. But the second half of life problem means first half of life, you're establishing your career. First half of life, you're figuring out who you are as a person. It's all ego building. It's getting a wife, a career, all of that stuff, a house, all of the things that are kind of important for this world. And then, and Jung would point out that death is actually the goal of the second half of life, is because that's what ultimately our entire life is leading up to. And so we start to see, and we have this, in our culture, this is sort of like a cheap imitation of the midlife crisis of like you got by a car or something like that. It's what you're trying to do really is recoup some of that youthfulness, but you're also leaning into like, I am aging. What does my life actually mean? That's really what most of our problems come to, is that for whatever issue we might be struggling with, for myself it's anxiety, for other people it might be depression, for some people it might be suicidal ideation mixed with a whole bunch of other things. It might be bipolar disorder, it might be ADHD, autism, whatever these things might be. When we're struggling with them, we haven't quite found a meaning for our experiences yet. And so when I'm trying to, when you're in therapy, it's not a theoretical conversation you're having with people. You're talking to people about their everyday experiences, about their lives. And I can pull from my own life. I can pull from all these other sources. If they have a specific religious tradition, I can pull from those sources. If they don't, I can pull from, it's like a lot of the clients that I had at Community Mental Health, this was great, is that I had the opportunity of like, okay, you're a horror fan. Let's talk about how Stephen King's The Shining reflects on your period in life right now. Or let's see how, something like that. My favorite movie being the Titanic. So James Cameron's Titanic. So that has a lot of applications to people. And so I can dialogue with people about that. That was some of the ways that you really learn on the fly. And because one of the drawbacks, of course, is that you have the amount of clients that you have, but that's also one of the positives. It is just like, look, you're going to get experience to this massive amount of people, and you're going to come one person you're going to sit down with for 45 minutes that is mid-30s, that is just a complete emotional mess, and then you're going to sit with somebody who's in their 70s that's, you know, getting towards the end of life, and they're depressed and they need to figure out that of their lives. And that was incredible experience, because I think that it allows you to be able to grow as a clinician, to be able to have these conversations, the same types of conversations, but have it in a bunch of different ways with people. I can have a conversation with, you know, one of my favorite clients ended up being actually somebody that you passed off to me, a 13-year-old who's now 13. They were 12 whenever that you passed them off to me, and I absolutely had a blast with this client. Ended up being staying the entire time that I was there, my whole year and a half there. So, you know, and then I can turn around and have that same type of conversation with a 35-year-old, but approach it in different ways. So that was definitely something I don't think I would have gotten had I went somewhere else, you know, that wasn't community mental health.
Okay. Can you describe, we talk about community mental health burnout, but what does it look like through the Jungian lens, and which archetypes show up or showed up for you?
Well, I already said before that the hermit showed up for me, you know, already been a pretty difficult, you know, the thing that's had a lot of energy to me. As I said, our soul speaks through us a lot through our emotions. So to me, through a Jungian lens means that I'm listening to what my inner world is telling me at all times. I'm attuned to that. I'm not sort of just going with, well, this is just what reality is, and this is just what I have to do at this point. No, we have, first and foremost, our inner life to account for, not our outer life. That is what I treat as primary. Of course, I'm speaking as an introvert as well, so that I know my bias is there. But the hermit showed up that much more. Like, I would get home, you know, I worked there Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and I would get home, and my wife, we eventually kind of established a routine of, like, I would get home, and I would do a Qigong practice, sometimes with her, sometimes just by myself, and we would eat, and we'd watch a couple movies, and it was just a quiet, very calming moment. There was no deep conversations. I don't have the capacity for deep conversations in these days. And then I would take all of Friday to do absolutely nothing. I mean, not talk to anybody. My phone is off. I'm just kind of sitting with my own self. Sometimes that looked like just sitting there and listening to or watching YouTube videos for a day, or watching movies, or playing a video game. But I'm sitting with myself. And then Saturday was really my spiritual recruit day. When my wife was at work, I would, because my wife works weekends, I work some weekdays, so we kind of have this where now I get the chance to be by myself during the evening. So I would do lots of different things. I would do breathing exercises. I would do Qigong. I would do inner work while I'm reading books. I'd read books for a couple hours a night, and then I would do Jungian-themed reflection questions based off of them. And then at the end, I would do... Now, I had the help of ChatGPT on this, but I would be like, what might some spiritual practices to kind of like honor the themes in this book look like from a Jungian lens? And so it would just kind of do those things and that was something that was deeply helpful, and I still do those to this day, but it did increase. It felt like I was living two worlds. I was like extremely expending all of my energy in those 3 days to where I'm overextending, and then I was really pulling back on those 4 days that I was off. And so, you know, that wasn't the healthiest, dynamic, which is why I'm not there anymore. But it was what I needed to do for the moment. So it did kind of work for me. And now I'm sort of having to regroup and refigure out what I want that to look like now.
In some ways, you've answered my next two questions. I'm going to ask one of them, though. Is there a story or a transformation that stayed with you from that community mental health experience?
It's a great question. I really feel like there was, in community mental health, you will have a lot of people that are every which way. You'll have some clients that you'll talk to I had a client, actually, another one that you passed off to me, that it was not a client that I was particularly fond of, but I saw this client for over a year, and I was like, I haven't done anything with this client. Like, I have sort of tried to get this client to look inwards to see this, but anytime I do that, it falls on deaf ears. So essentially, I was just kind of holding that pain for that client for that time period. And then just like that, next week, I want discharged from all services from there. And it's like, that happens quite often in community mental health. But it's those ones that, you see the growth happen. And I will say, just to generalize, the most success that I saw were with the clients that were in active recovery. We got a lot of clients from the halfway houses or the three-quarter houses or the homeless shelters. The mission is near us, and Lighthouse. Those types of things are, the mission is, I think that's, all around the southwestern Pennsylvania. So those are places that I found the clients were most willing to work with my, with the approach and to really soul search and to do that work, because they were already doing the 12 steps. So they were already actively in this process of understanding where I went wrong, and their egos were out of the way enough to where they were very open to that. And those ones really still stay with me. Those are the first ones that came up.
And the mission has a spiritual component to it, so that makes sense that they're already, doing that soul searching there, and they're either interested in it, or it's the one thing they came in complaining about. There was no, in between. When it comes to, obviously you left community mental health. We both know this because you were just overwhelmed with, a caseload even 3 days a week. That was so much. And the idea of bring someone in, next. Bring someone in, next. Other than those real draining experiences, if those had been removed, were there other ethical or clinical tensions that influenced your decision to leave?
So I was thinking about that question, and as I was telling the supervisor that's there now, I said, I have tried everything. I tried to reach out and say, hey, what if we did a little less? What if I did a little less? Like maybe one an hour and did a 45-minute session. But if I even went to the 53 minutes, I'd still have 7 minutes to complete my note and to just breathe and to just, and there was inflexibility on that. And I said, that's really the one and only reason. I enjoyed everybody that I worked with there. Yes, there was definitely some drawbacks and maybe some understanding of, ultimately, all the drawbacks for me, though, is just the reality of working with insurances and working with that. You're under certain guidelines whenever you're in a community mental health. If you have a client that says, hey, I went and, they called the cops on me the other day. I mean, technically I was supposed to do my note and then I can't even remember the name of that note now, that I was supposed to complete on top of that. Mm-hmm. When I'm already seeing and I'm already struggling with completing that note. So, I mean, really, for myself speaking, that was really it. Like, I wasn't able to do the type of work that I really felt like, and everybody was commending me for how good of a job I did, and, I'm hoping that means that in the future, that means that, like, I was flying there so I can soar later, because I was barely getting by, and some clients, I mean, the reality is, if most of those clients show up, like, if I'm scheduled 10 a day and and 8 show up, probably by that 6th or 7th client, I'm about 50% capacity, and I'm kind of checked out at that point. I mean, that's just the reality of it. Mm-hmm. I mean, and that is an ethical consideration to, like, you're just not physically capable as a human being as sitting there with 8 people a day. I mean, other than that, I had obviously some frustrations, and the treatment plan thing continued until after I was there, by the way. So that was just got taken care of a couple months ago. But, those things, again, that's the reality of dealing with insurances and billing and all of that stuff. Like, I don't really have to deal with that stuff anymore now, because I create one, and Simple Practice gives you the option to just set that out 2 years. So now I don't even have to think about it for that amount of time. So, I mean, the reality is that I just, those things were the big things for me of the decision to leave. And it was difficult, because you're there a year and a half, and as I said, I had 6 clients left still that I started with. Of those 30-some-odd clients that I started with at the very beginning, 6 of them were still left, and then even there was a good dozen or more that I had deeply, real deep into. I mean, it's not a friendship. It is a relationship of some sorts, though, and it is intimate, because you're talking about the most vulnerable aspects of their lives, and you're bringing in your life a little bit to the field as well. It depends on how much, I do a lot more personal, bringing in my own life experiences than I think is recommended by the average, like, college professor that says, but I think it is therapeutically necessary. I trust my intuition. Mm-hmm. That's, and I follow my intuition, and that's not always right, of course, but I follow with what it says, like, do I feel like it's needed here? And there's sometimes when I've seen that, and it really hasn't come through, and I'm like, okay, lesson learned. Like, maybe with this client, I don't do a whole lot of that with. So, that I think that's the long-winded way of answering the ethical consideration of, can I see 10 clients a day, 8, 7? Where's my draw line? Like, where do I draw the line of, okay, this is the exact amount that I can see and no more?
So the first thing I want to jump in and say is that when Andrew is talking about some paperwork that he wasn't doing, it was not things such as mandated reporting. It was additional things that the county was requesting, additional things that the agency was requesting in an attempt to facilitate communication. Whether it worked or not, that's a totally different story, but if we've all been there in community mental health. Something has to fall through the cracks, and if that's going to be what falls through the cracks, rather than someone who's being seen on a regular basis, and you were the unicorn of having every single person consistently coming in and seeing you week after week after week after week, where there were other therapists who would see someone and for 3 weeks they wouldn't show up, and then they'd show back up. So some people had breaks, some people didn't. It just, the beast.
Yeah.
That's as far as I think I can go with that one.
And one of it is compliance issues that's over our own, where we were, over their heads. So I'm not blaming that on them, the person there. I think that their hands were tied and they're just trying to enforce that. But yeah, it's nothing that would have been, there's a lot of things whenever we're starting out that you just have a lot of that stuff to do that you just don't. When I'm going to school to be a therapist,
mm-hmm.
I go because I want to be with clients and talk to clients. I don't go because I want to do notes. I want to, I don't go because I just live for the treatment plan. Those are just things that are like, well, if I have to do it, I have to do it. But I know somebody who's cash only who hasn't done a single note other than if something important happens, or if something that could be an ethical thing, they write that stuff down, but otherwise they're not doing notes in sessions. So they're cash only, so they don't have any insurances to, and I envy them a lot, because I think that's more authentic of a way, but that's just the reality of the field that we work in, and I know that you've talked about that in previous episodes.
So you're shifting out of that community mental health into a group or private practice. What's something that surprised you most as you're shifting from one phase into the next phase?
Something that again, I talked to you about this before we got on, but you don't realize when you're your own boss, when you're able to create your own schedule, it's amazing because of that. Because it's like, if they say, hey, why don't we do, Tuesday at 5, and I'm like, actually, I have something going on at that time. How about Tuesday at 4? And you can do that. You have the flexibility with that. With community mental health, it's like, well, I have to be here between the hours of 9 to 5. So I don't have an option here. And if you want that time and I have it available, I kind of have to give it to you. And so with that, it does give you the freedom. But again, the drawback is real. And at this point in the amount of people that are engaging in therapy are slowing down a little bit, because just strictly financially that people want it more than ever now, actually. And then, of course, having to be your own advertiser. I am not good at that. And of course, again, we went to school to do one-on-one therapy. I can sit down, that's my bread and butter. I sit down, you come to me, I talk. I'm not good at all. I'm very good at public speaking. I am very comfortable with that. Obviously, being going to school for that, I would hope so. But I am not at all good at advertising, at trying to, here's my business, come, I am completely lost at that. So that is a surprising thing at just how much you have to do that for yourself, especially starting out. My supervisor has since told me, once you get established, there's a lot of word of mouth. There's a lot of just, you get established and you're there for years. It just happens. But yeah, first year, you have to do a whole lot of that. And just how much of that is involved, and just how little feedback you get from people, or just how little that you get from people that say, hey, I want to come see you. You just think, I get my Psychology Today profile up, and, here comes the invites. People are just going to be messaging you left and right, but that's just not the reality.
No, unfortunately, we're both in that phase where we're seeing that the hope of people just beating down the door isn't happening because of the economy, isn't happening because there are a lot of other people out there and so many people to choose from, and insurance. Being two unlicensed therapists, being two who are provincially licensed, there's only so many insurances that we can take.
Yeah. And, I have it set up through us that, and you do what you can with that, and I tried to talk, some clients into it and say, well, what about a very small cash fee that we have on file and everything, and it just wasn't, so far it really hasn't panned out to be that much. And as I left community mental health, obviously, ethically, I couldn't ask them to be like, hey, I would like you to come to my private practice with me, because it's just not ethical. But there were some, I gave the option to everybody of just like, here's the options. You can go with somebody else, or you can follow me if you really want to. And there was about a half a dozen that did express interest in following, and so far that has been 0 people. And so I was not surprised by that at all. But the reality of the situation is just, it is actually literally impossible for us to see anybody on Medicaid. Even our supervisors we can't bill our supervisors through that. So that is sort of the thing with the, that's why I think I like that this podcast exists, to sort of get that information out, that is a reality, as you're sort of in this in-between. You got this associate license where we can see Highmark and UPMC pretty easily, but as far as everybody else, it's kind of iffy, and Aetna and Cigna, you kind of have to bill through your supervisor if your supervisor has it, and if not, then you can't see them, and you have to charge a cash fee. And if they're willing to do that, I know, because I haven't had insurance since I was 27, and I'm 33 now, so all of my therapy services has been done out of pocket. So that's another reason why I am very aware of that, and I'm very aware of the financial burden that takes for people. So that is something that I've also wanted to be in as well. But the reality is that people are just in financial difficulties right now, and I can understand.
Well, everyone, Andrew and I are going to take a brief break to wet our whistles and just stand up and stretch, and then we'll be right back with you. So that was part 1 of my conversation with Andrew Shroyer, MA, LAPC. We have part 2 coming out next week. I'll include in the show notes ways to get in contact with Andrew. If what you heard in this conversation made you feel like, finally, I'm not the only one feeling this way. If you heard things about counseling that was eye-opening and new to you, or you heard something that a colleague has brought up that they have interest in, hit the like button, subscribe, forward the podcast so that we can spread the word, because we're always unlicensed as long as we continue to learn. We'll be back next week with part 2 of our conversation with Andrew. See you then.